The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome back, everybody. Week 3, getting past the halfway point now. Hopefully you've been enjoying it thus far. And before we kick off tonight, just want to cover a couple of interesting things and the usual housekeeping issues that we need to discuss and cover. So for those of you that are wondering why we're stuck at the poll, I'm just putting the poll up there for everyone. I'm going to close it off now. We'll begin our presentation element. There we go. So yes, we are in fact up to topic 3, week 3, and we are going to talk about a few different things tonight. And for those of you who've had a chance to listen to the pre-recorded audio, you'll have a bit of an inkling as to what we're going to cover. But before we do that, I just want to talk about a couple of things that we have discussed and discovered about how we're going to be able to go through this and deliver, and how we're going to deliver for you. So let's go through our housekeeping stuff. Now this is for those of you that might be joining in for the first time. It might have missed previous ones, or might not be familiar. I want to talk about the questions box. You'll find in your control panel the questions box. That's the place to put your questions during the webinar tonight. Now I want to talk about questions because we had a lot of great questions last week, more than we were really ready and prepared for, and we didn't do them justice. So what we've decided to do is I'm going to take the top 50, the top 50 questions out of last week's webinar, and I'm going to rephrase them and record answers in a presentation, and I'm going to stick that recording up on the website and the portal. So we'll get that done in the next couple of days for you, so that anyone who raised a question last week will be able to listen to that and all their questions, or a question very similar to yours, because we'll try and make sure we cover everything in that recording and presentation. So I'll try and make it a little bit more brief and punchy. It won't be interactive, of course, because it'll be a pre-recorded session that'll cover all these. But hopefully that will mean that we're going to be able to cover as much as we possibly can about what you guys particularly want to know. Now, with regards to tonight, what that means we'd like you to do is keep the questions coming. We'll have a slightly different format tonight. With what I mean is we're going to have a slightly shorter period of time devoted to the presentation and a little more time towards the end devoted to the questions that have been coming in tonight. But any questions that we don't cover during the webinar tonight, we will pick those out and make sure that we do the same thing, cover them in a recording as best we can. So this is a part of our empirical Agile-based delivery of our Agile project, in the sense that we're going to evolve how we're doing it, and I would have loved to have given this to you already, but we couldn't fit it into the current sprint, so we're going to get it into the next sprint, which is our next week. So, so hopefully that'll make sense and be useful for you. So throw the questions up. We've got people involved at the admin level. We have Alex again with us tonight, who'll be helping with the questions, and Chantel will be helping to field those questions and line them up and pull out the best ones that we can try and cover during our discussion later on tonight. So just while we're in the admin discussion, a few other things to mention. Of course, most of you will probably all know all this. There is, of course, the online portal. It's important that if you want to get the most out of the course, we encourage you to go to that portal, grab the recordings, grab the pre-recorded, look at all the content that's up there, join in on the forums if you can, if you're interested, throw your questions. There's been a little bit of activity there. I'd love to encourage a little bit more, although I understand that we did ask and suggest people wanted to put their questions up, but I'm guessing that it's going to be a lot easier to just listen to the recording for questions, etc. But there are still interesting things going on in the forums. Of course, the webinar recordings, even if you've listened to the webinar, if you want to get more out of it, usually it's valuable to be able to listen to it again. We do have audio-only versions that will make it easier to play it back at chipmunk speed. Makes it a little bit quicker, and of course YouTube versions for watching it at any time, anywhere. There is, of course, study guide information up on the portal, which helps as a bit of a guide for what to think about, and the pre-recorded lectures, which quite a few people are tapping into now. We've put them in bite-sized chunks of around 20 minutes each, so hopefully that makes them digestible on a trip from A to B. Now here's the links. The first link is the portal link. Most of you hopefully would be familiar with that. The second link, we've had some questions about wanting to know more about how to engage more different courses, different subjects, and how to get more into it and what we can do. That's the link to go to check for your eligibility for other elements of the Master's program. So this is obviously a bit of a teaser, the short course. As I mentioned in the week one, it is an excerpt taken from content that's delivered as part of the master's programs and master subjects. But if any of you are being curious about what you can do, how you can study further, and what is available, that's the link to follow. Rather than, we'll actually put that link up in the portal as well, so you'll just be able to click on that. You don't need to write that down because I don't think you can copy and paste out of that at the moment. So we'll put it up on the web portal. So that'll be a link that you can follow to find out more about IT Masters and the larger subjects and courses and programs and qualifications that are available for anyone who's curious about further study. Okay, so as I mentioned, keep the questions coming. We will pause for questions at the end of the presentation discussion tonight, so rather than interrupt it with questions as we go. But so make sure that when you put your questions up, make sure they're contextualized so that when we come back to them, we know what you were referring to when we discuss the question in the later stages at the end. So let's have a 2-minute recap in talking about Agile, what we've covered so far. These are core principles that we've already gone over and talked about. And we've talked about the fact that Agile methodologies are typically more useful for empirical projects, projects where we don't know everything up front. Because if we did know everything up front, we'd probably be tempted or interested in using plan-based project methodology. So we've already know that, yes, it's about empirical projects where we learn and discover as we go, we make decisions as we go. We know that this happens through iterations, so it's a cyclic process of going through an iteration, see what comes out of it, review, go back and do it again. We know that we're focusing on value. It's less about the costs, it's less about the restrictions and the constraints, and it's all about how we can create and deliver value. And to do that, we know that it means we need capable people, we need empowered people, we need people who have buy-in to what we're doing, we need people who are switched on, tuned in, and motivated. And through all of that, we're hoping to achieve innovation. So we know that Agile is to maximize the possibility for innovation through this process. So it's not just about delivering what was originally expected. It's delivering the best value we can from the journey that we've undertaken along the way. So here's a quote, the first of our double quotes tonight is in regards to empirical exploration. This is, Lawrence Krauss is a physicist, a modern-day physicist. He's the chap largely credited with understanding or postulating the theory of dark energy or dark matter in the universe. Physicists are often recognized and rewarded for the answers or the theories that they uncover that resolves questions, but his claim to fame is regarding the question that he's posed of, well, where is all this energy coming from? Where is all the matter in the universe? So his quote here we're saying is that empirical explorations ultimately change our understanding of which questions are important and fruitful and which are not. And the meaning that we take from this in an Agile context is to say that the journey of exploration helps us define what we should be doing. So as we go through the motions of achieving something, as we go down the path, we learn about what path should we be on, and we learn about how we should be walking that path. So it is an intertwined process. It's not exploration purely for the end game. It's exploration also to uncover the right question. And this feeds back from an Agile context, and we see this in situations where a customer says, I want you to go and build me this. And halfway through they say, well, you know what, I thought we wanted that, but really, given what you've done and delivered, we'd be better off having one of those instead. And because it's an Agile project, and because we've embraced innovation, we are able to change direction, change our path, change our vision, and move in that direction and deliver what the customer has decided is their ultimately best value. So it's as much about evolving the question of what we need to do as it is about evolving what we're going to do. Now this week, this topic is talking a little bit about some of the methods, and we are going to dig a little bit deeper on some of these methods. And I've picked a few for specific reasons, because when we talk about Agile, we do need some degree of framework. It's great to have these philosophical awareness of how to think about it as a toolbox, but usually we need a little bit more granular than that. So these are a difference in context. We look at Scrum, we look at Lean and Kanban, and these have a different emphasis. They have a different focus. And this is why we've sort of picked these for the discussion. But we've got extreme programming up there in a slightly different color. because it's not fundamentally different in the same way that the first three are. It's an extension of Scrum in its purest sense. So it's an example of saying, well, let's pick one of these and then let's adapt it purely for our particular industry and our particular purpose. Now, for those of you who have already tackled the pre-recorded lecture, some of this will already have been unveiled. You'll have a bit of an idea. We're going to dig a little bit deeper graphically on some of these and talk a little bit more about it. We're not going to go into much detail about extreme programming. We do cover that a little bit in the pre-recorded audio. But a second quote is from a chap by the name of William Blake. Now, William Blake was an English poet and was regarded as being largely mad by his contemporaries at the time. He lived in the early 1800s, and he had some what was believed to be pretty radical views on the world. It's only sort of in more recent times that we've been able to appreciate the forward thinking that he might have demonstrated at the time. But his quote was to say that the true method of knowledge is experiment. So the point that we take from this is to say that to know, you have to do. You have to try to be sure. You can postulate, you can theorize, you can expect, you can plan, but to know, you must do. You must experiment. And we embrace that with Agile by saying that we not only embrace the opportunity to experiment on what and how we do things, but we immediately try to leverage and make best value of the knowledge that we gain from our experiments and put it into practice and make use of it immediately. So let's have a little bit of a chat about Lean. Keep the questions coming through, folks, as we go, anything you can think of. There might even be a little bit of double up with last week. That's okay. We're not going to be going into too deep on any particular question, so that won't matter. So let's talk about Lean. What's Lean? Now, Lean began its originality in manufacturing with Toyota, and it was primarily about the removal of waste. Now, that sounds somewhat simplistic in a sense, but if we talk about waste on a particular item, then we're talking about trimming off the excess fat. We're talking about cutting off the bit around the edge. But if you're talking about activity, if you're talking about time and money and labor as resources, then you're talking about efficiency of action. We're talking about how can we reduce wastage in effort and activity, which is a slightly different equation. And it raises the issue of something called opportunity cost. And Lean does deal with this because when we have any investment in any particular activity or any particular project, or even at the smallest scale, if we invest an hour in something, the opportunity cost is, of course, all the other things that we can't now do with that hour. It's the opportunities to do something different and perhaps reap rewards from those other things that we let them go. We let that opportunity pass because we've invested it in this. And this is our opportunity cost. So what Lean is saying is that we need to keep an eye on the opportunity cost of everything, because we need to make sure that whatever we have invested in is yielding a return for us. Because if it's not yielding a return, it probably falls into the category or should be analyzed as being potentially wastage. Now, one of the most hard to uncover, or when Lean first came into existence, one of the most significant areas of wastage that was uncovered is delay. And what we mean by that is that the time taken for things to be completed, the delay in which idle time arises. So anything that's idle, as in it's not growing, it's not expanding, it's not moving incrementally closer towards a status of completion. So if it's idle, it's causing delay. Now, if it is incrementally moving forward, it's not considered delay. It might be slow, but it's not the same as a delay. So Lean is telling us, look for the causes of delay. And if you're talking about traditional Agile things such as software, what that means is we don't half build a piece of code for something and then put it aside, leave it on the shelf, and then don't touch it for a few weeks whilst we build other code. Because we've created an opportunity cost for that particular piece of work because it's not useful, it's not complete, it can't be measured, it can't be reviewed, we can't do anything with it. So we've sunk time into that, we've sunk resources into it, and we can't move it forward towards completion. It's in a state of delay. It has an increasing opportunity cost because that investment is not yielding any return. So these are the things that Lean tells us to focus on. But it's also saying we need to be clear, because ambiguity is another source of wastage. We know as human beings that when we are uncertain, we supplement the absence of fact with assumption. And we all know that assumption is not quite a good thing, especially for projects. So it's a focus on saying clarity is a key element of lean, because by making sure we maximize our clarity, we're reducing the possibility of waste due to error and poor information. But the concept of testing is a little bit, I want to go into a bit of detail on this because this is something specific with lean. When we talk about testing with lean, we're talking about the efficiency of correcting something as near as possible to its point of creation. So the theory holds that if we make something, identify some weaknesses, failures, faults, and then immediately begin the rectification process shortly thereafter, we generally have a more efficient rectification process. And you can equate this quite simply as, you know, human beings, the longer we leave something, the less we remember about it, the harder it is for us to bring all that into the top of our mind and work with it. And that's the simplest version of it, but that's where the origin of the idea. So it talks about appropriate testing or auditing or checking of things to maximize the efficiency of on-the-spot correction and adjustment as necessary, rather than put it into a testing pipeline by which time it comes back so much later that the original creator or creators are going to struggle and lose time and efficiency to get their head back into how they need to fix it. Which of course brings us back to communication. And really we can't talk about efficiency and the removal of waste without talking about communication. And communication touches on a few of these points. I mean, obviously it touches on clarity. Ambiguous communications versus clear communications, we already know that that's going to make a big difference. But leveraging communication is about making sure that we communicate enough, we communicate just enough, we communicate adequately, we communicate in a timely manner, and we don't over-communicate. To some extent, you could put bureaucracy in the category of communication, because a lot of bureaucracy is about over-communication and unnecessary communication and the distractions that come out of that. So if we remove all waste, then in theory, all we have left is value. And this value statement is a lot of where lean taps into and joins the Agile pantheon, if you like. So let's have a look at the 7 principles of lean. We'll sum these up, and we're going to look at the 7 principles of Kanban in a moment, and we'll be able to make some comparisons. So first of all, eliminate waste. We've covered that. Leverage learning. Lean says if you're going to remove waste, then you need to maximize what we learn. If we learn how to get something right because we've had to correct something, then we need to magnify that. We need to leverage it. We need to make sure that other people that are working on similar things have the right communication and therefore gain the insight to the lessons learned elsewhere so they can leverage those lessons. It means that we make sure we don't keep making the same mistakes, or that other people don't have to make mistakes that, well, they don't have to make. So leveraging learning is not about compartmentalization of knowledge and compartmentalization of learning. We share it. But also, we decide on things only as and when we need to. And this is something we covered early on in Agile, where we talk about the fact that just-in-time decisions are generally considered more powerful decisions. The closer we can make a decision to the availability of the information to support it, generally, the better our decision will be. And when we make a decision further in advance, we're essentially planning, which is sometimes we need to do, but only if we have to. And then we say deliver promptly. Now, this is about making sure things don't delay. This is about getting stuff out there. The sooner we can deliver something, the sooner we can put it out for the review and feedback, the sooner it can be complete and start moving down the value chain and delivering value. So delivery is an emphasis in lean. It's about getting it out there. And if you think about the origins of lean being in a manufacturing sense, in an assembly line context, it's easy to see how the deliver promptly is part of the assembly line mantra. But here we then say empower people, because what this is recognizing is that to do all these things in a relatively short period of time and efficiently and cleanly, you need people that want to do that. You need people that want to be efficient, that want to be waste-free, that want to be empowered. But the last point takes all this from a different angle. Seeing the big picture, when we have, whether it be an assembly line or whether it be a iterative project of software creation, we're ultimately creating something whose value is assessed not only from the incremental creation point, but from a large scale. So yes, we have the value equation that we've already talked about last week, about at the end of any time box, we want to be completing things that can be assessed in their own right as whether or not they have value and how much value, because we need to then take that feedback into our next time box. So if we're focusing a lot on creating value at the micro level, we need to make sure that the whole of the project is at the very least the sum of the parts, and usually quite a lot more than that. And this is where the big picture comes into play. And usually the big picture is the responsibility of someone other than the people who are working on the day-to-day. So you usually have a strategic vision and a tactical vision that are generally a different headspace and generally a different point of accountability. So let's have a chat about Kanban. Now, Kanban is about the tracking of the flow of activity. One of the key elements of Kanban is visualization of what is going on. And by that, typically, we mean a visualization as in signal cards, because the name Kanban comes from the Japanese name for the word of signal card. So a true Kanban management process is going to have perhaps a big board up on the wall, and it's going to have cards or some other representation of activities or stories or features or work parcels that exist, and it'll show them and their progress through the pipeline visually. So you can look up on the board and see what's where. Now, the important thing about seeing the entire pipeline in that context is that you can easily see bottlenecks. You can see bulges in the pipeline. You can see that a whole ton of work is piled up behind Fred and Mary. And Joe, in front of them, has not got much to do. That sort of thing you can see at a glance if everything's in a simple representation. Now, of course, we're not always in a physical situation where we can happily put post-it notes up on a whiteboard, nor is that necessarily ideal. There are digital alternatives to these, of course, especially if you have a distributed team. But the important thing is the overall visualization of the pipeline to readily see the health of the flow in the pipeline. So with Kanban, we're more focused on changing how we do things rather than what we do. It's a focus that says, well, we're going to evolve how we go about this, and we're going to do it incrementally. We're going to do it bit by bit. So it is a gradual process of change. Kanban is not a process that says, right, you're all Agile tomorrow, so read this book and come back in on Monday, and we're all going to be Agile now. Kanban specifically says, no, we don't do that. We respect the existing situation. We look at incremental change, and we say, okay, well, if we're going to shift our operation from this model to that model, let's first look at what it is we have and how we can evolve our principles to that. So some of the questions that came in previously about, well, how do we help a team shift from one to another or from one type of system to another? Sometimes some of the elements of Kanban gives us clues as to how we can go about that through incremental change. Now, that doesn't mean that incremental change is always the best way. Sometimes the sledgehammer is the best way, but that's why we have to make those decisions on the spot with our own team. So Kanban, as much as Lean originated and is often suited to manufacturing style of work, Kanban is often more suited to a maintenance style of work rather than design. Kanban doesn't talk as much about innovation and iteration as, for example, Scrum does. So it's more suited in its pure form to certain things. And certainly we know projects that wouldn't really be able to put everything up on a visualization process. But Kanban's big thing is that it focuses on incremental change. So let's look at the core principles and see if you can see how some of these might line up with what we've already talked about. The first step is what we just covered. It's visualizing the workflow. The visual element is because we humans can very easily see imbalances, and with spatial recognition we can see patterns visually far better than we can see patterns through any other method. So a visual representation shows us patterns that say, well, look, everything's evenly distributed through the workflow. We're all good. Green lights across the board, that's great. But bulges and gaps, delays, things that are getting stale, much easier to see from the visual point of view. Second core principle says, limit the work in progress. Only take on board what that portion of the pipeline can handle. This is the pull-down principle of Kanban. This is where we say, this particular section of the process has capacity now. We've just completed something. We now have capacity. Let's pull something into capacity. Equate that principle to what we talk about with time boxes and sprints in Scrum. We complete a sprint. We now have capacity. Now we pull new work into our plan for the next sprint. During the sprint, we don't talk about what we might do in the next sprint. We don't pull new work on it. We don't create this enormous backlog for any part of our team by saying, well, when you finish that, now do these next 55 things. Because we might be saying, well, here's 3.5 years worth of work just lined up in front of you. What we say is pull the work down only as the capacity becomes available, which is another way of talking about the same effect that time boxes have. So then we say manage the flow, which is another simple way of saying, well, keep your eye on it. It's basically saying be proactive, look at the reporting, have ways of understanding what's going on so that we can manage by improvement. We can actually make changes that matter. But because Kanban is about changing how we do things, the fourth principle talks about making sure that we make things explicit. Now, the point of making things explicit is when you're dealing with incremental change. We want to take the emotion, the conjecture, we want to take the subjectivity out of things as much as we can. So by making things explicit, by defining things in explicit terms, we allow them to become more objective. By being explicit, we can say this is what it is. This is precisely what it is. And we can help those that are dealing with it to move away from how they feel about it. We can help them move away from their subjective perception or perspective of what something is. Because the process of making something explicit is generally a collaborative process, after which we have something that is, whilst not always agreed upon, is at least more difficult to be at odds with. Then we say use feedback loops. Feedback loops, well, we're familiar with those. We've already talked about them. We talked about the review. We talked about in Scrum. We talked about sprint reviews. We know that the iteration process requires feedback. Kanban is saying that if you want to incrementally evolve, you want to have some information to use to evolve with. That only comes from the feedback loop. And the last point, a bit like Lean, the last point kind of steps aside and is a philosophical or conceptual point that says to be involved in a Kanban-style project or a Kanban methodology, we need to have a commitment to evolve. So this is the buy-in element. This is where we say that it's important for the success of this methodology, for the success of these processes, to gain a sufficient level of commitment from everyone involved that says, well, we're not going to have a massive change right now, but we're going to embark upon a process of incremental change. And the change is going to happen. We are going to evolve. And the point about getting that buy-in and getting it resolved up front is that if you have challenges getting that buy-in, if you have resistance, if you have people pushing back, deal with it at the beginning as much as you can. Because dealing with it partway through is usually going to be more along the lines of damage control. Because you're not going to be dealing with their reluctance, you're going to be dealing with their destruction or damage or the sabotage, which is a much more difficult beast to deal with. Deal with reluctance, don't deal with the consequences of reluctance, is what this is trying to tell us. So let's have a chat about Scrum, and then we're going to have a quick chat about some examples before we go into the layers. Scrum breakdown, 4 key elements of Scrum. Sprints. We've already talked about some of this. 1 to 4 weeks, depending on what you need to get into your sprint. You have a review, the backward vision. What just happened in our sprint? You have the planning, what's going to happen in our next sprint, and then you have the product backlog. The product backlog being everything that's going on in the entirety of the project. So from the simple breakdown of Scrum, we then have the roles. So it's a different perspective. It's not a series of principles. The role of the Scrum Master is the day-to-day activity, what goes on a day-to-day basis. The project manager is looking after the entirety of the project, the conceived vision from the beginning, and how is it traveling through its strategic pathway to success, whilst the Scrum Master is looking at what happens in each particular time box period. The product owner is responsible for the customer's vision. What is the customer getting? Sometimes they are the customer, sometimes they are representative of the customer. Their job is to make sure that the product itself is growing and evolving and accumulating successful value. And then, of course, we have the team, or teams, as the case may be, as key roles and functionalities. It's relatively simple. It's a lot simpler than some of the other structures tend to become. It's specifically trying to move away from hierarchical structures. It's saying that if you're not specifically got one of these first three roles, then generally you're part of the team. So let's look a little bit about how we put these into frameworks from an example point of view. So if you're looking at lean examples are where you are wanting to be efficient. Your primary objective is efficiency. If you're looking at the creation of infrastructure, for example, infrastructure is a good example of something that works within a lean environment because you have a need to minimize the wastage, especially if you have large-scale capital expenditure. So when you're looking at infrastructure, you're looking at leveraging capital expenditure, and a little bit of wastage or a little bit of misalignment on efficiency can result in some significantly leveraged consequences down the track. So in those situations, an example of where a lean paradigm is often very advantageous. For example, in a Kanban project, once something is up and running and you have a methodology of maintaining and managing something in an ongoing basis, perhaps something that requires ongoing improvement, the ongoing support and development of something that's gone live, then perhaps Kanban is going to be a more suitable, more appropriate method. But if you've got to build it from scratch and you need to create something that you're not too clear on exactly how it might look, you know what the vision is, you know what the intention is, and you need to do a fair bit of development and innovation and creation in order to bring it about, then Scrum, for example, might be a more suitable methodology because then you have more emphasis on iteration, you have more emphasis on innovation, and you have a different structure in the terms of the feedback loop. So when we talk about Agile frameworks, we talk about the fact that all these different methodologies, whether we have the Lean, the Kanban, Scrum, or some other variation of them, they still need to interact with the organization that they're a part of. They still need to interconnect with elements outside of these project paradigms that don't use those project paradigms. So this is where we try and tie everything together and we say that, okay, we've got these methodologies, whether it be Lean, Kanban, Scrum, and we're saying that we're using them for specific reasons and those reasons apply within the scope of the project or the activity that they relate to. But they don't necessarily relate to the business objectives that surround it. So the framework lets us say, okay, we can have a development project to create a piece of software using Scrum. We can have the infrastructure built using something similar to Lean. And when it's all up and running, we're going to use something equivalent to a Kanban-style methodology to maintain and support it. But all of these need to feed back into an organizational structure that can still make useful investment decisions through the process along the way. So it's not just about how we explore and it's not just about empirical projects. It's also how we deal with and interact with the non-empirical business objectives and business situation. So this raises the question, and sometimes a tug of war, is are we making these decisions from the bottom up? Are we saying, well, because these methodologies work within the context and confines of the type of work that they relate to, is that where the decision should be made to move upwards? Or do we have a situation where at the executive and the business or the organization level we're saying, well, we think that this type of work is best run with one of these, so this is how you're going to do it, and this piece of work or this project should be run this way, and that's how we're going to expect you to do it. That's an open question. It's an open debate. But the point is to see the pressures in either direction. Generally, knowing what the information that executive and the business organization is requiring to make their decisions is all we need to make sure of. As long as we're feeding back the right information in the right time frames, we can make sure that we meet the requirements of the executive and still operate with the right flexibility we need at the ground level. Usually, all the flexibility lives within the project itself. It's not typically within the organization. It's not usually easy for us to say to the organization, well, we want you to invest in all this now, and then we don't know what we're going to ask you to invest in next week. The simplest things such as cash flow planning means that organizations need to have a more predictive structure around investment. This is what brings us to the Agile layers. So these are the layers that we look at in terms of the framework for Agile integration within an organization. And the organization primarily happens at the governance layer. So we're going to look at a moment at another perspective on the governance model in a moment to cover how those differences work out. The governance layer is where we interact with the decisions necessary in the business planning. And this is usually a very strategic perspective. So if we look at the difference between tactical and strategic up the line in a typical Agile project, the technical layer is the most tactical. This is the layer that we look at that says how we're going to go about things. This is technical, this is practical, this is micro, this is incremental elements. At the iteration layer, this is our time box. This is where we complete things that we can then identify. So this is the layer at which things get reviewed and completed. This is where we incrementally build value. And the project management layer is where we look at the accumulation of features towards final customer satisfaction. It's also where we look at methodology. But it's also where we interface up to the governance layer. So the project management layer often needs to translate information and reports on health, on efficiency, on the growth of value as the project progresses, and translates that upwards to meet questions such as how are we progressing with our return on investment. Now, one of the big things that comes out of this is, what about risk? How do we handle risk in this context? How do we deal with the issues of risk when they are viewed very differently at the organizational level than they're typically viewed at the project or in an Agile sense? Now, there's an illusion that says, well, if we're Agile, risk is no problem, right? Because, we can just change. We'll just do it differently. If we get a risk, we'll just adapt. Well, yes, but sometimes it's important as to when we adapt. At what stage in the project do we deal with that risk? Because obviously, whilst we might be able to mitigate a risk with more flexibility, sometimes if we leave that too late in the life cycle of the whole project, we run out of legroom, we run out of flexibility. It tends to dry up as we go through the process. So let's look at the governance model from a point of view of how we need to manage the overall project to deal with the issues of risk. At the governance layer, we begin with the concept. So this is the envision where we say, okay, well, we've got this vision, we've got this concept. This is what we're all going to do. This is what we're investing in. Then when we get underway, we have a process of expansion. Now, expansion is the concept of doing different things. We expand what we're doing. I'll give you a practical example of what I mean. We are talking about, in this example, a software project. Now, in this software project, we need to do some database work. We will need to do some logic and algorithm work, some business logic rules. We're going to also then need to do some interface work because we're going to need to create interface for all this to be useful. And we're also going to have to create some APIs for it to interface with a few other things that it needs to talk to along the way. So expansion says, well, let's do a little bit of the database stuff, but then let's do a little bit of the interface work, a little bit of the business logic and the rules, and a little bit of the API work in some early stage of our project development. The reason the organization wants us to do this is because we uncover the most immediate, most obvious, most significant risk factors earlier in our project. So in contrast, if, for example, we didn't touch the APIs until the very end because we put them in our list as being the last thing on the list. So we do that at the very end. And then we find some real showstopper problems that suggests that maybe we've got to go back and redo some of what we've done with our database, and we've got to rearrange the business rules in the software to then cater for what the APIs need it to do. So we're creating an efficiency. We're creating recreation and wastage. And that's where the risk management comes in. Risk management says expand and do each little thing to some extent to uncover the most and first obvious risks. Then what we do is the process of extension. So extension then says, well, we've done a little bit of this, we've done a bit of API work, we haven't hit any major roadblocks yet. Let's do some more API work and go deeper. So it's considered a depth, whereas expansion is considered a width. So even though we might see Agile methods as being ultimately flexible and we can put anything we like in our time box, there are strategic reasons why some things are more suitable and more appropriate than others. And it's not always just about the customer wants to see this thing next week. Yes, those things and those variances, those things are relevant. And yes, we are delivering value that ultimately only the customer is going to be able to assess. But at the end, we need something that we can deliver as a complete package. So our success is tied into our ability to deliver. And delivery lets us tie it all up, put a bow on top, and consider it complete. So if we look at the iteration aspect of our delivery model first. In the delivery model, speculate, explore, adapt. Before that, we have envision. So in the envision phase, we are conceptualizing what we need to do. And then the cyclic process of speculate, well, what is it going to take to do that? How are we going to do it? What might we need? What resources? Right? Let's explore that. Let's start building that. Let's do it. Then let's adapt from the feedback. Well, that kind of worked and that kind of didn't. So we adapt. So we say, well, if that didn't work, well, then let's speculate on what do we need to do with it next. So this is our iteration cycle, relatively simplistic in nature. But of course, we need to close it at some point. And we did talk about this in the pre-recorded audio a little bit. The point of closure has many reasons. Not all to do with the fact that we need to finish it at some point. We humans need to bring closure to certain things. The business needs us to bring closure to certain things. We have to draw a line under it and say, well, this section is done now. Generally, we're not able to get the other factors, the other rewards, other than financial rewards, until we close it. The couple of other rewards that we're talking about is that whilst we might, for example, get paid incrementally for work done and value delivered, we might get paid indefinitely through that process. And it looks like it's constantly yielding return and it's constantly yielding value. But there are other forms of value that we don't get until we close it and finish it, such as goodwill value, reputation value. If we're building something that never finishes, it's a lot harder for us to build a marketing strategy around it and say, we built this great thing, except it's not quite finished yet. Perpetual beta comes to mind. So there are other non-tangible benefits and rewards that can only come out of the closure and completion of a project. Not least of which is the sense of morale boost and goodwill that comes out of feeling that the team has accomplished something that they can feel good about. Now, throughout this, we've talked about various practices, and next week we're going to go into a little bit more detail on some of the practices that are usually covered with regards to Agile projects. So we're going to delve into a little bit of those. There's some principles that we like to think about in terms of how those practices work. And these core principles of saying when we have a practice, we're talking about a way of doing things. So we're saying, well, we have a practice that how we do this and how we do that. Now, there's some fundamental principles that we like to think about that are useful when creating Agile practices. The first, and this is perhaps the most obvious, is that they need to be simple. And this is in contrast to the complex practices that usually come out of plan-based methodology, because a plan-based methodology has to be sufficiently complex to cope with a wide variety of permutations that are not yet fully realized and fully understood. So complexity is a normal part of plan-based delivery. Any plan for anything significant is going to be a complex plan. But practices, in an agile sense, are usually more successful when they're simple because they're easier to understand, easier to follow, and easier to evolve and change. We then say they need to be generative rather than prescriptive. What we mean by that is that generative means to produce, to create something. Practices need to produce outcomes. They're not about being a set of restrictions. They're not about saying what you can't do. Practices in Agile are about describing what things can be done by following a particular practice. Obviously, they need to be aligned with Agile principles at the highest level, which we've covered in a number of different ways over the last couple of weeks. And we say that the practice needs to be focused on delivering value and not compliance. So this is an echo of what we've talked about in week 1 and 2 about value. But we're talking specifically about the creation of a practice. And for example, if you're talking about extreme programming, or you're talking about software design, and we're going to say we're going to have a practice around how we test. So that's an example of a practice. We'll say our testing practice says that we use pair programming, for example. We have one person coding and another person constantly testing that code and compiling reports and feeding that back into the programmer, who is constantly able to update what they're doing and improve upon it based on the feedback from their colleague. That is an example of a practice used for the purpose of testing. Separately, you can have a practice that might say, well, we use a different testing methodology, but we have a practice that says, well, we test on this basis, we test in this time frame, we test to this extent. Another principle we talk about is making sure that it's just enough of a practice. We don't say that, well, pair programming means that you're going to work from this part of the day to that part of the day on that, and you're going to do this, and you're going to complete this many pages of reports, and you're going to do this amount of code per hour. We're only going to put enough into the practice to make sure that it does the job, that it generates the results that we're looking for. And when we're talking about different practices, for example, we might have a documentation practice that says that this, in our pair programming example, the original coder might be required to do a certain amount of documentation. Well, that needs to be mutually supportive to their partner who's doing the testing. The practice of how the testing happens and how the record keeping of the results of that testing feeds back into documentation. These practices need to support each other, which means you can't always create them in isolation. They need to be created in a collaborative, combined sense. The underlying point about practices is we say we're looking for effective practices. We're not looking for best practice. Now, best practice is a phrase or a label that we've all become quite familiar with. Best practice is about doing it the best way possible. And in some ways, it's a bit of an overutilized and slightly inflated term to say that we're going to do things by best practice, because that's always a subjective view. And it's always going to be influenced by our ability to fit within the restrictions of what someone else considers a best practice. But Agile is saying we're not aiming for what someone else thinks is great. We're aiming for what works for us. And we have enough knowledge, we have enough information, and we have enough collaboration and intelligence to be able to work to create the right practice, the most effective practice for what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, and who we're trying to do it with. Which some of you would recognize as a bit of a recurring theme for much of how the Agile principles unravel and unfold. Now, before we go and talk about and bring in some questions into the discussion tonight, I want to just make a point that's been raised a couple of times about real-life examples. What we're going to do in the next week is put up on the portal a few examples of situations or projects and pinpoint or pigeonhole the different principles that we've talked about and how they apply to a particular example. So we'll look at an example of a software production, we'll look at something else, and we'll show how each of these different principles and methodologies might apply and how we might use them. So we'll put that up with some brief information in a visual format next week, so you'll all have something to look at to give you some examples to work with, which might stimulate some different questions that might come through in next week's webinar. So I'm just going to ask Alex now if we've been able to capture a few interesting questions along the way, if there's anything that we can cover and chat about that's come out of tonight's discussion. And by the way, if you've got questions about anything out of the pre-recorded audio, feel free to put them up as well, because we can deal with any of that in the same context. So Alex, have we got anything to cover at the moment?
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in. Here's one. Regarding Kanban core principles, can you give some examples of dealing with consequence of reluctance and mitigating the type of project sabotage that you mentioned?
So if we're talking about changing how we do things, which I did talk about in the Kanban, and I did talk about reluctance. So there is an early step that talks about buy-in. And the first step to identify possible sources of reluctance is to have a buy-in exercise. And a buy-in exercise is where the purest form of buy-in exercise is not to approach a team and say, right, we're all going to do it this way now. A buy-in exercise asks questions. So a true buy-in exercise says, well, let's find out from you what you're not happy about. What's wrong with the situation? What's not going so well? Let's uncover what we all might feel needs to change. Then we ask the question, well, what if we did nothing about that? Would that really hurt? And usually when we try and understand the implications of what's wrong, what the problems are, we usually uncover more reasons to do something about it. And when we ask them, how bad is it really? What is the cost of inaction? What's the cost of doing nothing? That's where we can create some motivation for change. So this is where we can angle people towards a buy-in where they say, okay, well, yes, I have some problems, and yes, I really don't want them to stay as problems. I'd like to do something about it. Then you go to the next step and say, well, look, if I just came to you and said, here's the answer to all your problems, you might be a little skeptical, right? To which you hope the answer will say, well, yes, okay, I might be a little bit skeptical about that. So, okay, let's adopt a process that says we're going to change things incrementally, collaboratively, as in inclusively, and we're going to do it for the better. So we're going to change things incrementally, step by step, because we've collaboratively agreed that it's the right step to go forward. This is a little bit different from a process that says, right, we've all got a new manager, comes in and says, you're all going to do it my way from now on. Now, most of us are familiar with that. And so the contrast of that method versus the incremental progress is one of the reasons why the incremental change method is considered a more effective and more palatable. But it must begin with that buy-in discussion, and the buy-in discussion is question-oriented, not statement-oriented. So hopefully that adds a little bit of insight and some suggestion on how those things can work out and be improved. What else we got, Alex?
You mentioned that Lean focuses on improving clarity. Does that mean that it requires a lot of documentation? Does it mean that documentation processes are critical for Lean?
Documentation is, I would describe it as a tool of communication. It is not in and of itself a tool of clarity. And I want to make that distinction really clear. Documentation is not a tool of clarity, it is a tool of communication. And I make this example because you can have a 55-page document that says very little. Or you can probably distill and summarize that in a handful of points. So when we talk about clarity, it's not the extent of documentation. It is the structure of documentation that matters. So leveraging information and clarity is about a structured and staged growth of understanding. What I mean by that is that you have first summary of documentation. Anything that's large should be no more than 5 to 10% of its quantity devoted to what you'd call an executive summary of clear points. This is where the most clarity occurs. And the sad reality is that nearly everyone that's going to encounter this isn't going to read any more than that summary. So we need to convey the vast majority of the importance of the message clearly and succinctly in that portion of our documentation. Then you have a stage 2, which is the explanatory level, which is where we go into more detail about any individual point that's covered in that summary. This is for people who have a knowledge gap or a familiarity gap or a contextual gap where we say, we're going to do it like this, and they go, well, what does that mean? I've not encountered that before. There's a piece of the document that they can then go to, and they may only read one of those because the other points they understood clearly. Why make them read the whole thing? And of course the third layer is the technical layer, and that's usually only used by people who are directly impacted by whatever's in that document on a day-to-day basis, and they need a more detailed and thorough level of knowledge. So if you ask the question, is documentation important? Well, it is the communication of understanding that is important. And yes, of course, if you convey something verbally, there is a higher chance that that verbal information will be misconstrued, will be misunderstood, or it'll be forgotten past lunchtime. So the written expression, the written method is, yes, it's a very valuable way of conveying information, but it's far more important to talk about the structure of how that conveys. So in Lean, those things are important. Does it mean that documentation is avoidable or not avoidable? It depends a lot on exactly what you're doing. But the most important distinction is between context and content. So any communication, be it documentation or otherwise, needs to have the context shaped up in the summary at the beginning and the content available for those that need it. Hopefully that's helpful. Another long-winded explanation. What else have we got, Alex?
Can one person be both the Scrum Master and the Project Manager?
Generally considered not ideal, and I'll explain why. The Scrum Master is responsible for ensuring that the day-to-day activities are adhered to. They're essentially responsible for the removing of obstacles. They have a very tactical view of what's going on. They look at things on a daily basis. They run the daily Scrum meetings, the stand-up meetings where we say, right, what's happening with you, what's happening with you, what's happening with you, and they clear obstacles and resolve on-the-spot issues. Now, that is generally a different perspective than the project manager, who needs to sit above the strategic outcomes and provide an interface upwards to the executive. It doesn't mean they can't be the same person, but I would be reluctant to take that path, mainly because you need someone to be not only, well, they have to be highly interdisciplinary in their skills and in their mindset. They need to be able to be someone who can work with a foreman mentality and functioning at the supervisory level, and at the same time meet the objectives of executive management and interface with them on their issues. So it's largely discouraged to try and make the same person the project manager and the Scrum Master. What you do sometimes find, though, is the product owner and the project manager do sometimes line up. They are often, in small projects, they're often the same person because they have the same strategic vision. The product owner is the person responsible for the ultimate satisfaction of the customer who has a strategic vision. Yes, they look at things incrementally, feature by feature, of course, we've already talked about that. But their ultimate goal is strategic in nature. So there's an alignment of strategic vision between those two roles, which doesn't quite line up the same way with the Scrum Master. Next one, Alex.
Is the Scrum Master role maybe then similar to that of a project coordinator?
I'll answer that from my perspective. In the types of projects that I've run, yes, because it depends on how you define the role of project coordinator. So I just need to put that disclaimer on this because project coordinator can mean different things in different circumstances. But usually, if you talk about the coordinator as being a coordinator of activity and the project manager being a coordinator of competing requirements. So if you look at project management in a traditional plan-based context, it talks about things like you're managing cost, risk, time, resource, etc. And you've got these 6 competing parameters that are the responsibility, whereas a project coordinator is typically only going to be responsible for maybe any 2 of those at any one point in time. So in that sense, there is a similarity in the structural separation, which says the Scrum Master is looking at an activity-based, activity perspective on a day-to-day and week-to-week and sprint-to-sprint basis. So yes, I can see some parallels and some alignment between those two roles. But again, some people play fast and loose with titles and job descriptions, so it's not always going to match up. What else we got, Alex?
How is scope creep handled in Agile?
It's a good question actually, and I think we had a couple of those. That question came up a couple of times last week and was unanswered. This is a fundamental concept that we need to ask the question differently. You could, and I'll throw some scary answers to try and set the scene here. Scope creep is great. We love it. It's what we're here for. It's why we exist. It's why Agile exists. Now, for anyone in a waterfall plan-based background, that's probably just knocked them on the floor. To have that concept of saying, yeah, scope creep, that's fantastic, bring it on. But the truth is, this is part of the reason why some of these Agile methodologies came into existence. Because there are some scope creeps that don't creep. They charge like a wounded bull off in random directions. And so it's not about creeping anywhere. It's far bit more voracious than that. And so something had to be done to cater for the rampant levels of scope creep that occur in empirical projects. So when you scale that back and say, well, okay, we've got a project that has a much more moderate level of scope creep, but Agile principles are specifically there to help you. And this is where you start to see real hybrid methodologies come about, where organizations, they do have a degree of planning, but they have a horrendous problem with scope creep. And they need different tactics to deal with scope creep. And so tapping into some of what goes on, tapping into some of the iterative elements and I'm talking about the tactical workflow iterative elements of Agile thinking, can sometimes help with projects that are trying to be planned but are plagued with scope creep. So if the question is, how do you deal with minor scope creep in general, then sometimes hybriding the methodology used is the right idea. But if you're talking about a purely Agile project and saying, well, how do you deal with scope? The first thing is you don't have a scope. So the scope doesn't creep. What you have is a far less prescriptive definition of what you're trying to achieve, which is the vision. So envisioning is not the same as scope. It's nowhere near as detailed, and it's nowhere near as limiting. It's nowhere near as focused on this is what you're going to do. Because the scope from the traditional plan-based is it's all the work and only the work necessary to deliver the project. So if we think about that statement for a minute, the scope is defined of all the work and only the work. It's everything and nothing else. You just can't say that with an Agile project. And in fact, the fact that we can't say that is why we're Agile. So scope creep is a paradigm shift. And when we talk about, we just don't talk about scope creep in an Agile context. It's adaptation. It's the basis of saying we're going to evolve and the client wants something different next week, and that's okay because that'll be more valuable than what we would have done if we hadn't let them creep the scope. And it's all about value. And so as long as the process of determining the suitability of value, and as that value requirement evolves, is done astutely and carefully and not randomly, like, oh, let's just try this, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. No, there's a bit more certainty about the thing of saying, well, customer actually knows that this will be a better outcome, so we'll allow that scope creep. Because of the fact that we're not worried about what we're going to be doing in 3 sprints' time. We don't really care too much about that today in sprint 1. Sprint 15 or 5 or 6, etc., if we're talking about scope creep between now and then, it's not really relevant, because quite possibly by the time we get to sprint 5, what we are working on and doing will mean that what we thought we probably were going to do with sprint 6 is probably already vastly different anyway, because it's a evolving path down the line. So it's a big question, because it's asking us to go back and rethink the whole paradigm and the whole concept about scope and what we actually do with it. So there we go. Hopefully that one's a little bit useful. Have we got more, Alex? We've got plenty of time.
Yeah, we've got a whole bunch. Should principles of practice be documented formally, or can that be handled through the culture of the workplace?
I would say there needs to be enough documentation for the removal of assumption, and that should be the end of your goal. So yes, you need a degree of clarity, because you need a degree of documentation that says this is how we do things. We talk about the slide we have up here. We talk about the principles of practice. If you have a practice or and say, well, this is how we do this, and we're going to document that sufficiently so that the disparity of people that we have that need to know about it can all understand it. You know, we might have people that have a different mindset and a different attitude and come from a different position. They do different things, and they're going to respond differently to the question of how do we go about this. So we make sure that we document something enough for the removal of ambiguity and assumption. But that's as far as we need to go. And this is the problem that I've encountered people in my experience who are pro-documentation, because that's their source of certainty. And in my experience, the people who enjoy the certainty of documentation is pretty much limited to the people that write the document. And most people outside of that realm of psychology, they prefer a more a more combined method of understanding. So what I mean by that is that if you provide enough documentation of how to do things, only enough to remove ambiguity and uncertainty, then you need to support that by a workplace understanding. So what I mean as an example is you distribute a document that says, this is our new testing practice, for example. This is how we want everyone to think about and do testing. Then you need to have the removal of ambiguity. This is where you have a meeting about it. You have a discussion. You might include it in one of your stand-ups that says, okay, so everyone's got a document yesterday about the new standard, new practice of testing. What questions do we have? Let's talk about it for 5 minutes. We're going to explain it and discuss it. And you get a bit of discussion. What happens in that situation is that people educate each other. And when you are satisfied that your documentation is a starting point, the discussion is a contextualized conclusion, then they will continue to educate each other on an ongoing basis for a couple of reasons. First of all, they know that the people around them know. So if they're not sure, they know that they can ask with confidence someone near them for help and assistance. They don't need to always go back to the Scrum Master. But if they're not sure or they doubt whatever's being said, the Scrum Master is meant to be the authority on that purpose. So the Scrum Master in a Scrum situation is the right person to own that responsibility. But it's about delivering that knowledge and understanding and acceptance in such a way that your particular team or teams can adopt it and accept it. Next one.
Would organizations use both Agile and waterfall methodologies depending on the nature of the project?
As an organization, yes. I would say yes. I would say it's unlikely in small organizations, likely because smaller organizations tend to have a narrower range of activities that they embark upon. For example, you might get a software development company who does software, and separate to that, you might have another company that does infrastructure. And infrastructure might be more likely to have a more plan-based process, but the software company probably will do most of what they do with some form of Agile. So when you get to companies that have both, again, the structure means that they will usually have departments that have different management structures and are sufficiently separated in their methodologies that they can have a department that does the kind of work that lends itself to that kind of methodology. And I've seen organizations go through restructures specifically to align the departments and the people and the teams so that their methodologies are aligned as a more important criteria than aligning other more traditional elements. So you look at large organizations that line things up based on geographical proximity, or they line them up based on the type of product that they're working on, etc. And this is where we talked about at the very beginning in topic 1. Agile thinking is prompting the idea that maybe if we align people based on methodology, they can work far more harmoniously. And there's an interesting debate about what's harder to change. Is it harder to change the content of what we're working on, or is it harder to change the method with which we work upon it? What I mean by that is it harder to have a person work on one piece of software at one point and another piece of software on another point, and yet have them working in the same methodology? Or is it harder to have them work in one situation in Agile and in another situation in Waterfall? It's ongoing debate, open question, interesting discussion, but it really comes down to the specifics of what it is your teams do, what your organization does. But certainly there is ample room in large organizations for multiple. And this is where it gets really tough at the executive level. And we talked about the governance layer. That can be really difficult at times. And you need your best clever people in those sorts of situations to pull together the kinds of flow of information for good decision making at the executive level when you have a multitude of methodologies at play and the different way in which they handle especially risk.
Great. We've got another question about scope creep. I'll call it scope creep for shorthand. Does scope creep always originate from the product owner or the business?
Generally, in my experience, it comes from the product owner. It comes from the customer who is represented by the product owner. So if we say the business, sometimes the business is the customer. And if we take that perspective, if it's an internal project, well, then we still answer the question from the point of view being it's the customer. And that's the particular section of the organization. It's less likely to be the organization coming along and saying, right, do this extra. Now, that can happen if you're building a speculative product. And what I mean by that is that the customer in this context, if you're building a product for your organization that you then hope to take to market, and then when you've built it, you hope they come. Apple's a great example, right? Any handphone manufacturer, there's someone who are going to create a product. They will do plenty of research on what they think the market is going to want, and obviously, you know, some companies do better research than others, but they might trigger scope creep from an organizational point of view, because what will happen is that technology will move forward during the months that it takes to innovate and develop and create these sorts of products. And they'll have to go back and say, oh, no, hang on, we need the near field chip installed in this latest version before it goes out, because all of our competitors are doing it. And if we release this model in a few months without the near field chip, you know, it'll fall behind in market share. So, okay, so now we've got to redo how where are we going to fit this near field chip into this design, etc., and a bit of rework goes on. So there's an example of where scope creep comes from an organizational perspective, but it's still representative of the customer at the end, because the product owner is still the person who's saying, I'm the representative of this mass customer out there that we're ultimately trying to appeal to. There's still that representative function. So the answer still comes back to the product owner, because it's going to be the organization saying to the product owner, all right, we think that our intended customers for this are going to want this, so can we incorporate that into the user stories and into the epic of the combined user stories to make sure it gets implemented in some way.
A question regarding Scrum roles. If a software project is developed and supported by an external vendor, could the client provide, say, a Scrum Master, project team, project manager, or should the client have the role of the product owner?
The product owner can be an internal member of the team. As mentioned before, it can be the project manager. And the project manager is typically team-oriented rather than external. So when I say by that is, wherever the production team lives, there needs to be a project manager involved with that team as well as a Scrum Master. But the product owner is an interface point. So they can sit potentially on either side of that fence. The product owner can be someone that actually is not employed by the same organization. They can be someone who's external. And I've seen that sort of situation arise where you've got an external customer and the product owner is a person in that organization, but they may spend a great deal of time in the offices with the project team on a weekly or even daily basis, going through the review process. Their job is not necessarily as an individual to monitor everything. They might then have a team of user acceptance people back in the customer's organization that are working on activities and testing the value that's get created every time box and feeding that back information through the product owner. So the product owner can sit on either side of the fence, either the team side of the fence or the end customer side of the fence. But where it gets a little more complicated is if you then have a portion of work that is outsourced to a third party. So let's say your project team is doing this, this, and this, but in the example we used before, let's say the APIs, you outsource to somebody else. to some other organization for whatever reason. They still need to be viewed as a part of your team, and they don't have their own product owner. The product owner is still at the customer side. So whoever's managing the commercial relationship and accountability to the customer, whoever is taking the money off the customer, they are responsible to the product owner concept. So that they are responsible for making sure that the product owner relationship works well. So they can't be any further down the chain than the person taking the money from the customer. Hopefully that answers the question. I'm not sure if I've gone off track a little bit there. I might need you to elaborate if I haven't. What's next, Alex?
That's a good one. How can we work out the return on investment for Agile projects?
This is touches on the conversation of closure and delivery to some extent. It is difficult sometimes to measure return on investment based on accumulated value if we can't put a price tag on that accumulated value. So when we talked before about principles, and we talked about the fact that what governance wants us to do is to expand and touch on different things first for risk mitigation. That's great, but what the return on investment criteria asks us to do is actually the other way around. So return on investment criteria wants us to be able to say, right, database, done, finished. We've got to the bottom of the database work pile and feature set and backlog. It's finished. What good does that do us? Well, we can say, more accurately now, but we can say that from our original envisioning, we said at the time, well, we probably think that database work's about 20% of the project. And since we've got a budget of $1 million, then that's probably 200 grand worth of value. We might even have a commercial arrangement with the customer that says on a progress payment basis, once we've completed and can substantiate that we've completed the database structure and work, then there'll be a progress payment of 200K, for example. So we might implement that kind of return on investment regime when it comes to partial payments or incremental payments and confirming and determining value. So these are conflicting principles where for risk we want to make sure we've touched on everything and at least opened the lid and see if it's a can of worms or not. But for investment we want to make sure that we can close off elements that are measurable at a macro level. And I make that distinction because on a time box basis we're measuring value at the micro level. So we might be measuring, for example, a handful of features that do a handful of interesting things. But as a combination, they don't necessarily form a major portion of functionality for this particular project that we're talking about. Once we have got a major portion of functionality completed, then we can draw a line on it. This is the difference between where the project manager sits in this function. The project manager's job is to make sure that what is going on in the project timeline is periodically attending to the needs of return on investment by completing things that are modular or macro value so that we can, at a particular significant progress point through the project, we can say, well, we've finished this module and we've finished this module now. If there was no attention to that, the possibility exists that you might have 6 of your 8 modules that are each 90% complete, and it's hard to get the money out of the customer. So this is what we try and think about it. These are what we try and juggle, and it's the project manager's role that typically is the primary source of juggling all of that. Next question, Alex.
I'll try and combine a couple here. Had a couple of people asking what the success rate of Agile is like, say, compared to other methods or waterfall methods, and do you have any examples of when Agile can go wrong?
The statistics actually, Kelsey shared some statistics in week 1, and those numbers unfortunately have eluded me just now. What I might do is I'll dig up something more concrete and post it on the forum regarding that. But the interesting thing is generally, depending on which evidence you look at, generally success rate is still under 50%. But I mean, I've seen statistics that say that when you go for certain types of projects that usually benefit from Agile, you go from success rates of 30% up to 45%. So significant jumps, relative jumps in success rates. But it really does depend on whether or not whether or not you're measuring projects that should be done in an Agile format. Because if you do things that, or work and include statistics of projects that shouldn't be done in Agile, then you're going to get distorted statistics. If I take anecdotal experience from what I've seen rather than research, I would say that for those projects that should be done with Agile, roughly half of those get a better result, a significantly better result, because the other half tend to struggle because of how they've tried to implement Agile, or that, you know, they've got a confused idea of what Agile really means or what it really does, and they've jumped on it as a bandwagon rather than actually implementing it as a viable and successful strategy. So sometimes it's not about whether or not they do Agile that makes the difference of the success or not, but it's how they deliver and run the Agile that makes the bigger difference. You know, sometimes I have one situation where an organization was advised to use a plan-based methodology because it was deemed to be too high a risk to go through the re-education and realignment program necessary to shift that particular team onto an Agile mindset and methodology. But what was done is that for the subsequent projects, they created a parallel team, shifted appropriate people across into that parallel team, expanded and employed in the other parallel team, whilst the traditional team was allowed to wind down. So success rates, it's very much a rubber band, but it's substantial for any projects that, by definition, are empirical and should benefit. It's not double, but it's close to a 50% increase in success rates from what I have seen. More questions?
Someone with a better memory than mine has written and said that Casey said 30% for planned and 42% success under Agile.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you, Stephen, for that info. Very good. So yeah, it's not quite a 50% boost, but it's a substantial relative increase, which I think is the significant part of it.
Again, a couple of combined questions. How well can one use the Agile methodology with software like MS Project? Is there a place for Gantt charts and milestone charts when using Agile?
My advice would typically be to shift across to more dedicated Agile tools and software. And I say that for two reasons. It's not to say that you can't repurpose things like MS Project and traditional software, but it's to say that because we've talked about this as a paradigm shift and a mental shunt, it's often very helpful to introduce a new tool to highlight and accentuate that. And my typical advice is that if you're going to have a major shift of methodology, you'd normally accompany that, or should accompany that, with new tools. Now, some people will say to you, well, hang on, that means I've got to retrain everything. You know, they all know Office, so you know they're going to up in arms because I try and give them a new software tool to worry about. And this tech support team is going to have to support new software, and they're going to have kittens over that. Well, that's kind of the point. You need a certain degree of acceptable upheaval to create the kind of mindset that allows the other things to be less reactive. What I mean by that is that you introduce a new piece of software. That's not that out of the blue for people. You know, we're kind of used to the fact that we're going to have to use a new piece of software. If we can use that as the trigger for the upheaval, and then have all the other things that are perhaps more interesting upheaval elements fall in behind that, sometimes then that's the icebreaker that allows the momentum for change to take place. So that would be my advice. Change tools. There are some good ones out there. If you'd asked me this question 3 years ago, I'd say, well, look, you know, it's probably a bit hard to find good tools out there, but there is now. There are several. A few people, I think, have already put some suggestions up on the forum. If anyone has any suggestions or whatever that aren't on the forum post, please put it up there. I don't want to be proposing or suggesting any particular corporate tools, commercial tools from my perspective, but certainly there's some good stuff out there that's worth looking into. Next one, Alex? We've got time for a couple more, I think.
Yeah, great. I get the feeling this is probably a recurring question when it comes to Agile, but a few questions about costing. How are Agile project costed? How can you budget for material concerns due to a lack of complex planning? How do you know if the project's going to be within budget?
You have budget often as a control variable in an Agile project. So in the envision phase, right up front, before the lemmings start their work, you have this process where you gauge the scale of things. So the envision phase is about gauging the scale of total resources and the scale of separable resources. And what I mean by separable resources is you say, well, we're going to need maybe X amount of work hours and X amount of whatever for the database section, for example, of our software. And so you look at it in terms of scale. And then looking at the scale and say, well, we need this kind of thing. So, yeah, there's a little bit of overhead because there's a little bit of hardware we've got to get, and there's a little bit of infrastructure that we need. So that's kind of straightforward to measure. But then it's how long is a piece of string. It's how much effort are we going to put in this. And the envision phase is trying to put some sort of frame around that and say, well, we think we can get as much as we need to in a concept. So then it's going to be a case of progress analysis. So this is where the project manager's role is to look at the accumulating value that's coming out of each time box and seeing how that carries the progress towards the ultimate goal. Because if you see iterations that are constantly going over old ground, and for example, you see in a particular software project, you've got the client constantly causing or wanting new iterations for changes to the business rules section of the work, and you haven't even got to UI to any great degree yet, and you can see that more than what was originally expected is being embedded. It could just be the client doesn't know this. The customer just doesn't understand that they've just got into the gleeful joy of iteration. Yeah, let's do it again, let's do it again, let's do it again. And sometimes there needs to be that level of dialogue to say, okay, here's where we're tracking through the scale of resource predictions that we make. But you have to have those predictions at the macro level as a starting point. So we're not sort of saying, look, just give us an open check and we'll come back to you when we think we've spent all your money. No, you often have a budgetary time control variable that says you've got $1 million to do this with, or whatever the figure is. It could be 10 grand to do this with. And so, if you were to achieve this goal within that, how would you break it up? How would you proportion that kind of work? And therefore, that's going to give you some idea as to where the budget's going to go and how much you're going to need. And occasionally, that process leads to the conclusion that the customer's away with the fairies, and it's just not going to happen. You just can't get that for that kind of money. A very common discussion, but then sometimes you get the thing where the customer says, oh, look, it's really simple. I just want this. And, of course, that, by the end of it, they're going to want 10 times as much. And so you just need to be able to know why that happens, what are the forces behind it, and how you can make sure that, and this is what these sorts of courses and this sorts of knowledge is all about, knowing how to manage the forces at work so that we can constantly try and stay on top of them. But what you don't need to do is figure out everything up front to the nth degree. It's about managing the expectations and say, okay, Mr. Client, we are going to have these kinds of discussions now, and then we're going to have these kinds of discussions as we go through the process. This is the kind of information I'm going to give you. This is what I'm going to need back from you. And if you're cool with all of that, we can go ahead. Couple more, James?
Alex.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. My mistake. Alex. Yes.
That's all right. Change over. Is a project manager in Scrum optional, or is that a must for a Scrum team?
The role is not optional. And, I've seen the role fulfilled by line managers, not always successfully, but, the project manager, we sort of touched on in some of these questions, and we've hit on a few interesting things that fit squarely within the purview of project management that are not part of the Scrum Master's role. And this is an important distinction. And this question was already raised before and talked about. It's a tempting thing for people that aren't clear on how Agile works to try and mix Scrum Mastering with project management. And there's a little bit of danger in that. So yes, you need someone with the accountability to the organization for the strategic and financial success of the completed project. That's probably the clearest way I can find it. You need someone to be responsible for the completed project as a strategically and financially viable thing to do. So, and it depends whether or not it's an external or an internal customer. If it's an internal customer, then the organization is going to be saying, right, fix this internal problem, and how you're going to go about it. Someone's got to be responsible for whether or not that problem was fixed within the budget allocated, or within the expectations. Was it a good return on investment or not? And if it's an external customer, then someone's got to be accountable for whether that particular project is profitable or not. Because if it's not, then maybe we should be rethinking what we're doing and how we do it and what we charge for it. So yes, it's an important function that can't be overlooked, because otherwise you'll have projects that might be great fun to be in, but send the company broke. Maybe a couple more. Don't worry, everybody. We'll make sure that we'll bring these up in future presentations if we don't miss any.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get to all of them tonight, unfortunately, but we'll keep going for the moment. Can Agile methodology be used in fixed bid projects where you have to provide a specific service for a specific price?
Ooh, good question. Fixed bid implies the allocation of accountability and responsibility. This is the interesting thing about fixed bid, is that it's an assignment of risk. So we've got to think about what is fixed bid and why does it happen. And it happens because generally the customer is saying, I don't want to take risk on cost. I want you to take the risk on the cost. Now, the problem with that is that it's saying, the customer is saying, but I want you to have all the risk and all the accountability for what happens in this. And you can't then have a situation where the customer has carte blanche on changes and modifications to the vision or to the work or to the value or to the scope or anything else. Because what you're then getting into is a situation where the customer says, well, you're taking the risk on all the cost and I am the risk. Because you're taking the risk that am I not, or am I going to get out of control and ask too much? And so if you take a fixed bid arrangement into account and then think to do it in an agile way, remembering that Agile heavily relies customer approval and assessment of value. If you're going to do that, you need some pretty tight processes of how you manage that customer and their perception of value and their perception of the accumulation of value. And you're going to have situations where you should iterate, you want to iterate, the customer's value needs you need to iterate, but the contract says if you do that, you've got to pay for it, not the customer. So they're not quite chalk and cheese, but they're very hard to mix together, fixed bid arrangements and in that sense. And it's all because of the fact that you take on the risk, and the risk is, in fact, the customer themselves, which is counterintuitive and not always good business. 3 more. Alex? We'll get 3 more questions.
Alrighty. In a Scrum, who controls the flow of information?
Depends exactly on what kind of information you're talking about. If you're talking about feedback, there's 2 kinds of feedback, and they're controlled by 2 different people. So there's customer feedback. There's value-based feedback. So that is type A. That feedback is controlled by the product owner, and that feeds back during, in Scrum, that feeds back into the sprint review, or the first part of the sprint review meeting, the first half of it, which says, let's talk about the value that we created in our last sprint. What did the customer think of it? That information flow is the responsibility of the product owner. The other part of it is, well, let's review how we worked. That's the other half of the review in a Scrum review meeting. So we're saying, well, how did we go last week? Were we harmonious as a team? Were there problems? Were there issues, etc.? That's the Scrum Master's role. That's process. That's activity. The Scrum Master is responsible for that flow of information, for making sure that that feedback comes back out of the team and is circulated back to the right people and is properly handled. So 2 different flows of information and communication. The flow from the project manager usually flows into the Scrum Master and the product owner. It doesn't normally flow straight to the team, because generally the Scrum Master is responsible for the team and what they do. So when the project manager says, well, look, we need to finish the database stuff soon so we can issue an invoice and get a progress payment. So then the Scrum Master is going to be sitting down at the next time box or sprint planning meeting and saying, okay, right, team, we need to think about squeezing a bit more of our database stuff into the next sprint because we want to send the customer an invoice because that's all good. So that flow of information comes back from the project management as to how the overall strategic vision is going on. The rest of the communication flow is generally as a result of the empowered team members being able and encouraged to share day-to-day tactical, practical information that they need to get their job done. And that's where we touched on last week. We talked about the idea of clever interactions. That's what we mean by clever interactions. We talk about the fact that when people in proximity have the opportunity to communicate freely and openly about whatever it is they're doing, then inspiration and innovation will come out of that interaction. And you get two people communicating about something, and you get the leveraging effect of their combined intelligence on any given problem. So this is why that communication and information flow is generally free or free form. So that's if there's a particular type of information flow that you're asking about that I haven't covered, let Alex know, and we'll address that. But hopefully that's covered most of the information flow that we're talking about. So two more.
Yep. In the pre-recorded lectures, there was a mention of burn-down diagrams. What do these look like and how do they work?
Too big a question for me to answer here and now, but I will post some examples. So I'll post a little bit of information about that on the portal. I'll put a couple of links up and I'll put an example, and then that'll give you something to look at, etc. But it's a little bit more complex that we'll go into. So hopefully that'll give you something to look at, and then any questions you can throw them up either on the forum or throw them into next week's webinar, and we'll cover them then. So it's a wait and see on that one.
All right, fair enough.
We've got time for two more.
Here's another one then. Okay, great. How can you manage vendors or third parties using Agile?
Not exactly sure of the context of the question, because Agile manages the value in the work. It doesn't normally manage organizations. But the question might be, if I assume the question is to say, how do you manage those vendors in an Agile environment? I'm going to leap to the conclusion or the assumption that that's the structure of the question, and I'll answer that. So you let Alex know now if it's a little bit different, but I'll answer that in the meantime. How do you manage third parties in an Agile context? Well, if they're part of the production activity, then you manage them as a team or a sub-team, which means they need to be clued into the paradigm that you're working in. They need to understand what method of Agile that you're adopting, how you go about it. They need to be paradigm aware. Very much so, if they're part of or a portion or a contributor to your production team. So it can be a bit problematic to have your wonderful internal Agile team and you've outsourced something to someone else and they have a completely different paradigm and they say, iteration, what? You want to change it? No, you're not changing it. You know, that can be awkward, to say the least. So you need to bring them into the methodology and you need to get their buy-in. And I saw one example of where the lack of buy-in went horribly wrong, because they engaged the party, they went through, and then they said, right, and this is how we work. To which the third party says, well, no, it isn't. That's not how we work. If you engaged us because of how we work, right? Well, no, we didn't. Well, yes, you did. So you can see that can be a showstopper, and it's better to be a showstopper before you sign the contract than after. So managing third parties, and if you're then talking about individual contractors, the same sort of thing applies. You might have an expertise gap. And you need to plug that expertise gap with somebody that's got to sit in that role and perform that function. They've got to be paradigm aligned. You can't get away from that. And so it's got to be part of the buy-in process. It's right, you're going to come in and join this team, you're going to do this, this is how we work, this is what you need to be aware of. Do you see any problems with that? We need to talk about it now. Because if you feel that there's not enough capacity for alignment, it might be all the reason you need to make a different decision or a different choice. That's how I would view it. So, Alex, does it sound like we've got that context right for that question? Let me know if it's not.
I think it does, yeah.
All right, so we've got time for one more then.
All right. Can Agile methods assist in resolving conflicts in product owner priorities? Or put another way, how does Agile help a delivery team cope with multiple disconnected product owners?
That's a good question. So if we're talking about multiple disconnected product owners, usually Agile tries to have a singular point of authority. But if we say that the product owner, and we talked before about, they can often sit on either side of the fence. Let's say the majority of the role of product ownership is being conducted by the customer directly in this situation. And let's say there's quite a few competing interests in that customer. And there might be different people that are saying, or you might be creating, for example, software for an organization, and one manager wants this, and another manager wants that, and another manager wants something else, and they might be conflicting. They might be counterintuitive. They might be, they might be a great source of headache. So in that situation, how does Agile methodology help you deal with it? If you encounter that, or you think you will, you really need to have a product owner function on your side of the fence to run interference. So in that situation, the product owner from an internal perspective is not so much, it's still the representative of the customer's needs, but they are a distilling function. So the role of the product owner in your internal team is, in that situation, probably more important, and they need to be a more senior, perhaps more capable, a more effective person in some situations, because their function is going to be negotiation. They're going to be having to go out there and talk to the end customer and say, right, Fred said this, Mary says this, make up your mind, which one do you want? Perhaps a little more tactfully than that, I would think. But the role then is about condensing the conflicts into a point of clarity. Because otherwise what you have, and this is where the question has come from, I think, is that you have a situation where one iteration comes back and one portion of your customer loves it and another portion of your customer hates it and says, no, change it to this. And of course, we go around in circles. The main point of accountability and the particular role within the customer that needs to be most across this is the person who signs the check. So you typically have a project or product sponsor or champion within the organization, and if you don't, then typically you're going to be talking to the people that hold the purse strings. So my strategy in dealing with that would be to make sure that my internal product owner has a good relationship with the CFO or the person who is the final veto on the financial payout, because they're the ones that have got to be satisfied before I get my money. And if I turn around and say, well, look, I've redone this work 4 times because Arthur and Martha couldn't tell what was going on, I might not get that money, because they're going to say to me, well, why didn't you tell me that they were wasting my money? I would have only had to pay for it once. I could have fixed it. So it's whoever is going to view that wastage most harshly in the customer organization, they need to be best buddies, or at least on the hotline, with your product owner. And that might be the most important relationship you actually have. For everything we've just talked about with, yes, it's all about value and you've got to have that feedback loop, if that feedback loop is so distorted and so polluted that it's hard to get things done, sometimes the more important element is the restriction and the distillation of that into useful information. Because if it's conflicting, it isn't useful. We talked about the feedback on value. It's got to be useful. It's got to be something you can feed back. And if you know that it's only 1/2 of the opinion of the customer organization, you know it's already tainted and you're at risk if you use it. You've got to deal with that problem first. So there we go. Hopefully that's given a bit more information and answer. How is everyone feeling with all of these questions and answers? Is this generally been successful, positive and happy? I'm hoping it is. We've got lots of great questions. I'm sure we've gotten plenty more, Alex, that we haven't been able to answer. And I'm sort of hoping and relying upon we can pull those out of the mix over the next few days and separate the questions that we haven't been able to get to. And we'll make sure that before next week we'll get them in a presentation with similar sorts of discussion for people to take from it. And we've got a couple of things to talk about in the forums, especially the burn down charts that we'll put a bit of an example up and things like that. So we'll put a bit more information up between now and next week. Were there any other admin or background questions, Alex, that we need to answer about, and any how-to questions for anybody that are not content related?
No, I think we've just about covered it, actually. I think we're okay.
Okay. Or I know there's a little bit of interest in case studies and specifics. We cover those sorts of things in the full subject, because remember in the full university subject we have 10 weeks, 10 topics. And so we get to spend a bit more time in case studies and specific examples. And we haven't included a lot of that sort of stuff because we're trying to give you all a lot more of the feedback. But what we'll do next week is we'll try and incorporate a little bit more of that in the webinar next week because it might help crystallize some of the things that we've covered. So we'll take that feedback on board and see if we can give you a little bit more of that in next week's webinar. So thanks for those thoughts and feedback for those that are contributing on that. In the meantime, anything else that anyone wants to, if you don't have time tonight, you think of anything tomorrow, just use the forum, stick it up there, or remember it for next time. Next week will be our last webinar. However, we will still have a follow-up question discussion afterwards. So there will be a subsequent recording of any leftover questions that we don't get covered next week. So still bring your questions along next week, even though it's the last webinar, etc. So, all right, well, we'll wrap up there. Thanks very much to everyone for joining in. Fantastic questions, fantastic turnout. Thanks for everyone for all of that. Thank you to Alex and Chantel for the help with everything tonight. Look forward to chatting with you all again next week. And until then, good night.